We did with Felipe, he's over there. So I don't know why it's only my name there. I work with Felipe in this work. We start in July. Our first goal was to try to have a very good database for this work, and that was very, very difficult for Paraguay. It's very difficult to have all the data that we need for the paper. For consistency, we try to use only the source of the central bank. We use the historical memories of the central bank. We start to copy and we create our database. And we have almost everything. And your comments is going to be very useful to continue with this paper. So, okay. I think this, okay. This is the presentation. We have a narrative of the periods. We try to find in the whole performance, the history of Paraguay, we try to find the nominal stability. The history is not very common from Latin America. We have our currency, that is Guarani, has like 72 years. We have the same currency for that period. So we don't have big inflations in the whole period that we are going to see right now. And I put a lot of graph to try to understand here together all the things that we have. So, and I'm going to show you the performance of the growth of the GDP too. So this is, we did a growth accounting to try to show you the importance of the Itaipu constructions. That is maybe is very important for the GDP, and is also very important for the income of the government. I'm going to show you.
Maybe you should explain what Itaipu.
Yeah, Itaipu is Itaipu is with Brazil. With Argentina is Yacyretá. Yeah, produce energy and export to Brazil. And Yacyretá produce energy and export to Argentina. And it's very important for Paraguay because it's like, I don't know, 10% of the GDP. Yeah, is the export of the energy. And it's not only important for the GDP, it's also very important for the income of the government. So, and maybe it's one of the reasons why Paraguay didn't have big inflations. So we split the history of Paraguay in 4 stages. The first one, we don't have data. We read a lot about this period. It was after the war, and it was characterized by a poor economic performance, evidence of negative GDP, per capita growth, fiscal deficit, and a lot of money issues. We have a table I'm going to present in a couple of seconds. Is all we have. And after that, from this period, yes, we have data, and it's almost all the Stroessner government, and start with a very important policy that is a stabilization policy that he implements, that his main goal was to growth, but with restoring the monetary problem that he has in this period with fiscal stability. Those were his main objectives, his main goals, to try to have economic growth. And maybe there is this explanation why Paraguay has a very low inflation in those periods. This period, we didn't study a lot. We focus in the periods that we don't have a lot of data. We thought that is going to be a good idea for this first presentation. But we have something here. And after that, from 2003 to the present, we start with the second stabilization plan that implements the government of Nicanor Duarte Frutos. One of the main policies that they start to implement is the inflation targeting that we start to implement in 2004. Okay, This is a table that we saw in the Bolivia's paper about his monetary and fiscal history. We thought that it's a good idea to present Paraguay, the economic performance of Paraguay with this table, because we have all the countries here. Here we can see that Paraguay, in this period, 50, 59, I don't know if you can see, but the performance was very bad. Here it was not so good too, but in this period, 70, 79, it was the first, almost in the second. Those years was good too. I'm going to show, for trying to understand this, we did a growth accounting. We follow in Prescott and Quijo. I'm going to present. For these periods, and we don't have a lot of data for this period, we only have this, and we can see that the poor performance in the economic growth per capita. The inflation was very high, maybe the highest in the economic history of Paraguay. We can see the fiscal deficit here and the monetary expansion, maybe the biggest in our history. After that, Stroessner, it was the president in 1956, 55, 54. And he started the stabilization plan in this year. He tried to solve this problem, and his main goal was to stop this inflation and the fiscal balance. So with that stabilization plan, that is almost from here. This is the path of the inflation. In these years, he recovered the inflation, and the inflation, the peak is like 18%. This period, we related with the oil prices shocks. And this is a very interesting period that we are going to explain later. It's very related with the debt service, but we are going to explain later. This is the GDP per capita, the path. This peak is that we thought is very important to explain. That's why the growth accounting. In this peak is very related to the Itaipu construction. Okay, I'm working a paper of trying to explain this with Andres Neumeyer. We are working to trying to explain what happened in this period, and maybe I'm going to present, I don't know, in another moment. But with the growth accounting, it's very useful to see what happened there. This is the trended GDP per capita. This is the construction of Itaipu, almost everything. And here it finished the Stroessner's government. And we start in democracy until this year. We didn't study a lot this period yet, but we have financial crisis. We have a lot of things there. It's a very, very complicated period. Well, but in this period, we have here, we have a change in our export products. We start to export soya and meat. Those products were very important until this period, and almost everything, the construction of Itaipu, almost everything. I'm going to explain.
Sorry, the trend is a constant trend?
What?
What is your trend?
A constant, yes.
A constant.
Yeah. This is the real GDP per capita relative to Chile. We chose Chile because we saw his performance and it was one of the best in the table. So we chose Chile. Here we follow Prescott and Quijo. We did we transformed the technology of the firm like this. Here are the results. Or in the paper that I'm writing about Itaipu, my guess is that almost everything here is because Itaipu. But Itaipu has two effects in the Paraguayan economy. One is this, is the construction, the investment in construction to build the dump. And the other one is the effect in the income of the government. because when this money put everything Brazil.
And when did the construction
It started in 74,
And it finished in
in this year,
82?
81, 82, yeah.
But you don't see much action in the capital stuff?
No. Here the GDP growth at 9-10% on average, 12-14% per year. And the capital didn't grow.
But that's
Investment in Itaipu doesn't count as capital?
that's
Yeah, but it's first, Brazil put all the money, and Itaipu, it wasn't a resident for the national accounts. So a part of the investment is not in national accounts. Only the spillovers of the.
yeah, but then maybe it would be interesting to include it.
There is the paper, yeah, or with no measure. Include,
Okay. Yeah, then that's
Itaipu.
why, I guess that's
Yeah.
why it's showing it as
Yeah.
TFP.
yeah. Include Itaipu in national accounts of those years.
But so just to understand, the electricity produced doesn't count as GDP either?
No, in those years, no.
I see, so this effect on GDP is just the spillovers?
Yeah,
But then it's export, then it's not consumption, it's not investment.
exports only.
No, then Itaipu, where is Itaipu in your GDP? GDP is going up.
Yeah, this is the spillovers of Itaipu.
This
Is Itaipu, it wasn't in the national accounts in those years.
It's like in Norway that they measure GDP and then oil as a different.
No, but
Part.
Itaipu is in GDP because there is this huge spike there. But the Itaipu is there.
It's like
Investment has to be.
they start to build.
Not investment, where is it in national accounts? How do you get this big number if you're not registered in Itaipu? That I don't know.
It's in this capital investment, but the investment didn't grow as the GDP. So this is the relationship as capital stock over GDP. So it doesn't grow very much. But if I have a guess about the data that if we include Itaipu in the national accounts, and there, yes, you see the capital stock go up very much. But here, no, we didn't do it.
I'm sorry, but I don't understand.
Oh.
What do you mean that it's not in national account?
No, Itaipu, this is investment, is not in national accounts.
The blue line is GDP.
This is the GDP, this is the productivity.
Okay, but then the blue
Yeah.
line is GDP.
Yeah,
Itaipu is in GDP because it's going up because
the spillovers
No, I'm
or,
talking about they were spending on Itaipu that had
You know-
to register GDP because we observed.
yeah,
that
it is, but it's
investment,
not
what is it?
all. It's not all the investment. Here I have a data of the
There are two
investment in
different things-
construction.
two different things. One is whether the investment in that particular project is accounted for in the investment numbers. The other is whether the output that it produces
Ah,
is
yeah,
accounted. But it stopped
They start-
producing in
84.
once it finished.
they start to produce
I
here.
guess that they didn't produce until, I don't know, last work.
Another question was, if investment was so high, why is not capital growing?
So that's why the Itaipu investment
Because
is
the
not
Itaipu
counted.
investment is not accounted.
But I guess when
No,
they were
it has to
building,
be, because then otherwise GDP doesn't
no, but
go
they
up.
demand labor, Paraguayan labor, maybe the wages
Yeah.
go up and so on, and that goes to GDP.
They-
I think that's-
Then my question is, where is this register? It's not consumption, it's not investment, where is it? The GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. It's net export. Then, you're
No.
selling things to the
Oh,
Brazilians.
you don't have
then-
consumption here. I don't know.
No.
So,
But it doesn't matter.
so this was a dam, right?
Yeah.
So the workers in the dam were Paraguayan, presumably?
What? I didn't
The
understand.
workers in the dam,
Paraguayan and Brazilian. Yeah.
Paraguayan?
Yeah.
So for the Paraguayan ones,
Yeah.
their wages,
Yeah.
the wages that these workers make, are they in the blue line?
Yeah. Yes.
They are?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so then it's fine.
No, but it has to be in consumption or in investment. Then you have two sides, investment and production. And my question
In
is,
terms
where
of the
is it in the
sum,
production
in
side?
terms of the sum, it's in there. And then if
But
you
it
see
could be.
It's an investment.
Consumption. It could be that they
the income from the
they have
Paraguayan
the
workers.
measure it.
No, but here he's not
It's
talking
not
about,
incompatible
he's doing
with
the
that.
growth account.
Right, but if
Yeah,
it's
but then-
investment, that's fine. It doesn't matter, we can talk.
Yeah.
We'll talk about
A part is in
it.
investment, a part is in consumption. Yeah, a part, but not the whole.
But this is what you get from national accounts
Yeah.
today.
Yeah, and this is the part that doesn't count in national accounts. That is investment. My point is that the investment need to be more higher than that we have here. That is my point. And the production.
So this one is just Itaipu's investment. The next plot.
Yeah, is
Can you put the next plot?
yes.
This is just Itaipu's investment. And this is
In the Paraguayan side.
Is
The
it?
national accounts, the figure before is from the national accounts, the data.
Yeah.
So the capital is from the
Yeah.
national. So when you
Yeah. And this is the part that we don't have in the national accounts. It's an approximation because we have the whole investment, and in a lot of parts say that a half is the investment is in Paraguay and the other half is in Brazil. So this is an approximation. And this part, this growth in the GDP is explained by investment, consumption, almost everything. Especially the construction of a city that the name is Ciudad del Este. When they start to construct Itaipu, that city didn't exist, and right now is the second city in Paraguay, and they construct in those years. But the national accounts didn't take this into account, and that is our work trying to put this investment into the national accounts the best way that we can, because it's not only to put in investment like construction, because we need to take into account that the machine, the start-up machine, we import that, so it's not very easy. And the other effect of this policy that Stroessner did is the income from Itaipu and Yacyretá. This is the income that received the government, because the government received money from Itaipu for two reasons. First, because they use the Paraná River to produce energy, so Itaipu pay to the government for that, is the royalties, and the compensation, because Paraguay is the owner of the 50% of the energy, but they consume like 7%, and they sell to Brazil the other part. And for that, Brazil paid to Paraguay a compensation. In 2000s, it was like 45% of the revenues of the government. And maybe this is playing in the budget account. This is playing a lot why Paraguay didn't use a lot of money issue. Here, with Itaipu, we only see 2 periods of deficit. This period, I'm going to explain later, is because the debt service. The firms, the public firms, Stroessner tried to maintain this growth with a policy of investment in construction, the same policy, but with another firms, public firms. They use external debt to try to finance that construction, but we have a lot of corruption there, and the government, they use seniors to finance this deficit after. So I'm going to show you this. And this is the fiscal balance excluding the revenues from Itaipu. From 1993, we have always deficit without Itaipu. So the budget constraint, we changed a little. We follow the Bolivia's paper. We saw that we have maybe the same problems. So we changed a little and we put Itaipu here, and we try to put the deficit of the public firms to try to see if the results are related to the history that we have about that. But we don't have a good data. We don't have a time series for that. So
Public companies.
yeah. So, and it's very consistent. for what we have. This is the result.
The full revenues are measured in dollars.
Yeah, that's why you have the same treatment.
So the dollars is in the contract.
In the contract say reales or dólares, but always they pay in dollars.
But
It says the same for Argentina. They right now want to pay in pesos. We don't want
Really?
to. So
and somebody put pesos or dollars.
The reality.
yeah, with Yaceneta is pesos or dollars, and we don't want pesos, so they don't pay right now. So yeah. Okay, this is the budget constraint.
So we stop payments.
Yeah, Yaceneta, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
For how long?
Like 3 years.
4 years. Okay.
3 or 4 years, yes. Yeah. And okay, here.
But you didn't cut the electricity.
Polish, yeah.
No, we can't.
Oh,
No, we
it's
can't.
unfeasible.
You can switch it off.
No, we can't.
It's
No.
in the board.
It's in the border. So I don't get that.
Yes, it's impossible. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Here we have the results, and here, okay, here you can see the importance of Itaipu in the incomes of the government, especially because we have the primary deficit very high, but they financed this deficit with the Itaipu's income. In these years, they use a lot of the external debt, and this debt is the public firms, and that was the policy of Stroessner, and he wants to maintain the growth rate of the years.
Oh, but you do have data on the public enterprises then?
We have, this is the residual.
Or you use it? Oh.
We did this to try to see if the results are consistent with the few data that we have.
Okay.
The story that we have, yes.
So conceptually, the revenue from Itaipu should go with the revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It should be on the other side of the table.
Uh,
You don't have a primary deficit. You have this revenue from Itaipu. Then,
yeah. We only try to do like this, only to see the importance of Itaipu, like only to see this, only to show that maybe if we don't have this, maybe yes, we are going to follow the same direction than almost all the countries in Latin America.
And then you should call it just primary deficit, excluding.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
this
then
is
it would
excluding
be-
Itaipu. Yeah,
And then it would be better to have it on the bottom.
yeah,
Formally,
yeah. Okay, okay. Yeah, it's only an exercise to see how important is Itaipu, like a source to financing the primary deficit. In this,
The question here is, we spoke about this before.
Yeah.
Because Itaipu is a public company, but it's not inside of the public account.
Yes.
This is part of the reason of you use the data or the data of deficit like this. It's normal in many countries in Latin America that they have public companies that are, the ownership is from the state, but the way to account is outside of the public.
okay.
So this is a problem because we use the manual of IMF from 1986 that admit that kind of treatments. The new manual that from 2001 it's impossible to do that. So this is a problem in many countries. In Uruguay it's a particular problem to the public manuals.
Yeah.
But
In Argentina, I believe this for sure.
But that depends on the legislation.
Yes.
So is it or is it not a capital revenue from the point of view of the government? Because some countries
The revenue is-
enterprises are outside the government and you can consolidate, but there are other countries where capital income is considered as
okay.
as a revenue. For
Okay.
example, in Argentina, in the 90s, at the beginning, you have the capital revenues that came from privatization of public enterprises, and that made the surplus, the private surplus. And then in the second half of the 90s, then the privatization income ended, and you had a problem.
Yeah. In this case, the income is because they use the river to construct the dam, and for that reason they pay a royalty per year, and the compensation is because we don't use the energy and we sell to Brazil, and the government receive a compensation for that. The revenue of the company stay in the company of Itaipu. So maybe I didn't explain very good what is this, but it's an income that the government receives every year. Right now, it's almost very important, but I'm going to show you that it's less important than in these years that we saw, because a government with the second stabilization plan started a tax reform, so it's less important, but it's very important. This is maybe the conclusions for the periods. Here we saw the seniors was the first one, but we think that it did not cause inflation due to the high GDP growth rates. The second is that we start to increase our external debt, but relative to the GDP, it wasn't too big. In this period, if you remember, we have senior and external debt, but in this period we have that I say before, the plan of Stroessner to grow. He tried to recover the growth rates of the period of Itaipu with the same policy that tried to invest in constructions. But in this period we have a lot of corrections, so you can see all the investment you can see in national accounts, but you can see in the debt service of the amortization and the interest rate that the government need to pay for that external debt. There you see, I have a picture, is this one. We pay a lot for the debt service, but you don't see all that money in national accounts in constructions. Don't see, but most of the books.
So, but this is debt of the government.
Yeah, the service.
Service of the debt.
The amortization and interest rate that we pay in those years for the external debt that the public firms use to invest in constructions. Where are that constructions? We don't know. We didn't see in the data. Where are they? We read a lot of books, and they mention that in those years we have a lot of corrections. Was the final part of the Stroessner government, and it was we have a lot of corrections in those years. Yes.
Do you have data on the total debt?
Percent of GDP.
No, but this is the service of the debt.
Yeah, this one.
The stock of debt. So why the service can? I mean, one of the things that happened is the interest rate went up in the early 80s.
Yeah, see.
But that seems.
And a bigger devaluation that we have.
Also, that could have been the exchange rate.
Yeah.
The real exchange rate. So it would be useful to check.
Okay.
What happens when you adjust for the real exchange rate?
Okay.
You have 10 minutes.
Yeah. I stay here. Okay, and this period we didn't analyze very much, and we have a financial crisis episode in 1995 that we didn't have time to analyze, and we are going to do it for the next presentation. And maybe the most important thing that we want to mention is that we didn't find a relationship of the fiscal deficit and inflation, or only in maybe this period. There is the period that we pay the debt service, because the public firms financing his constructions with external debt, but we didn't see a relationship with these variables. Our guess is that it's the stabilization plan that Stroessner implemented in 1956. The other reason is maybe the income that the government receives from Itaipu is our guess of what happened there, why those variables are not very related. That is everything.
Thank you very much for inviting me on a very short notice. As it's stated here, I am visiting CRAE for the rest of the academic year, so I'll be here until June, and it's my pleasure to actually visit Barcelona. So I came in last week, and I noticed that this conference was going on, so I emailed Juan Pablo and told him I was coming. So he said, "Oh, do you want to discuss this paper?" So I said, "Sure," And then it turns out, I wasn't really ready, partly because, I don't know anything about Paraguay. And in fact, I wasn't aware of this effort, which is, I congratulate you on this effort. But, it was a good opportunity for me to learn something about Paraguay. On the other hand, as was clear from the presentation, partly my job is more difficult because this is only the start of the project of the paper. So I was discussing with the author, and he was actually emphasizing the fact that a lot of the discussion was hampered by the scarcity of data. And when we actually write these kinds of papers, of course, we are always dealing with these kinds of obstacles, and that in some sense that's one of the main lessons that we learn, how difficult it is to actually, especially to go back, way many years back, to actually understand what's going on and how some of the issues actually connect with each other. So for some reason, my comments are actually essentially some immediate reactions to the slides, which is all I had to work with. And to some extent, they are taking to be suggestions about potential directions that the authors may want to take their work to. I understand now that I actually been here more than a couple of hours that the project has a particular emphasis in particular on the fiscal, for example, revenues and uses of fiscal revenues and so on. But I thought that in looking at the presentation, there were a number of very interesting questions that you may actually want to think of, at least in the future. So, essentially, first thing that strikes me, facts about the Paraguay's long-run growth. As I said, I didn't know anything about Paraguay. First chart, I don't know if I can actually look at the previous. Let's see. Are your charts still here? You took them out.
Yeah. The mouse here.
Uh-huh.
Will give you the ones that are open.
Okay.
So what's the name?
What was that?
What's the name of it? No. Well, no, it's closed.
It's closed. Okay, it doesn't really matter.
I close.
You closed it?
Yeah, I close it.
All right.
Yeah,
So that's unfortunate. Well, it doesn't really matter. No, that's fine. Because the point is going to the points are going to be very fast. When we look at the Paraguay growth rate over 60 years per capita, it's 2% per year. Right? That's surprising to me. I expected Paraguay to be. I mean, I always consider Paraguay to be a very poor country, and that's associated with a low growth rate. But in your table, Paraguay is in the middle of the table. It's not great, right? But it beats Peru, where I'm from. It way beats other countries, right? So it's surprisingly strong. It's in the middle of the pack in Latin America, and that's something that is worth taking note of. For at least two reasons that I can think of, right? That I can think of. One is Control L. Okay, I'm going to use this, I guess.
No, but you have to control L, so I guess.
Control L?
Yep.
Okay. And now, okay. For at least 2 questions in growth.
You didn't want to do control L, that's okay with us.
Right. Excellent.
There we go.
Finally. One of them is that Paraguay is a landlocked country, right? It has no access to the sea. Very important issue from the viewpoint of, for example, there has been some research that has emphasized that sea access is a huge impediment to growth. And of course, we have Bolivia complaining about the fact that this is the reason why Bolivia is so poor, right? Paraguay is a counterexample, is it or is not? I mean, this is actually an interesting question that you may want to actually start thinking about, or we should think about in general, because obviously, if it is an important obstacle to growth, then the political solution is very hard. If it is not, then you can actually argue, well, some of the Bolivian attempts to get access to the ocean with all the associated difficulties with Chile and Peru are overrated. The other thing is, well, in your table, actually, you had a 2% average rate over 60 years, but certainly it's being worse, better, and worse, right? Essentially better during the 70s and 80s, strongly associated with the dictatorship of Stroessner. Right? So actually, that's a very good thing to notice for a number of reasons. One is, well, we are uncomfortable with the idea that dictators may be good for growth, right? So I may want to say, why is it exactly that growth was so strong during Stroessner's era, right, relative to other periods, right? I may have some conjectures here. For example, the numbers that you presented were numbers relative or are comparisons relative to other countries, essentially, right? So it may be the case that because Paraguay was relatively less developed financially, entering the 80s, right? Paraguay was less vulnerable to the debt crisis of the 80s than other countries that had more debt, right? So that's one conjecture, but you may actually look at it in different ways, right? I mean, the case that comes to mind in some sense is Peru. I mean, Peru in 1995, when the Mexican crisis hit, had not yet returned to the international financial community. And in some sense, it had actually missed the big run-up in debts of the early 90s. Okay? But that, in some sense, favored the Peruvian economy afterwards, because when you look at Peru in the late 90s, it was a very stable country, especially compared with its neighbors. Right? So maybe with Paraguay, something like that may have happened. Right? But if you want to do that, then you might want to look at, for example, what was the situation, say, for example, relative to other countries at the time. You may want to actually look at sources of vulnerability more formally. I mean, when you think about Paraguay, the little I know that there is at least one important source, which is oil prices, right? I mean, you haven't said anything about, for example, how Paraguay reacted to different oil shocks, right? I mean, is it true that Paraguay imports most of its oil, if not all, right? Right. So that's actually a large source of shocks, right? And that's also related to some other issues that I'm going to comment. But also Paraguay is in the middle of countries that have had huge financial crises, right? Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, right? So those countries actually may have been the source of financial contagion, but you are actually telling me maybe not, right? I mean, when you look at the figures, then it's not so clear exactly what was the relationship between Paraguay and the neighboring countries, right? That's something that I would like to know if I want to understand the macroeconomic history of the period, right? Okay, so that's about growth and performance. The second set of observations refer to inflation, right? I mean, in your presentation, you did actually talk about the the importance of inflation as a start of, say, some reforms. But actually, that was striking to me was that Paraguay did not have hyperinflation, large inflations, especially in the 70s and 80s, when every other country that was around, were having inflations in the order of 500, 600, 1,000%, right? So, so that's something that I would like to actually, again, try to understand. The comparative performance of Paraguay in terms of inflation, especially around this period, was very favorable, right? Also, that was true of the Colombia paper, right? Why is it that those two countries did up? I mean, the inflation rates presumably went to something like, in the case of Colombia, 40% or right? But for Peruvian standards, that was bliss, right? At the time. Now we tend to forget, right, that 40% was supposed to be a very good performance. Those years. Now we're talking about only single digits. But that if you're talking about this long-run history, then you may want to actually ask the question: well, why is it that these countries actually did not have that kind of explosion in terms of prices? And that actually has to do with the oil price situation, right? I mean, for a lot of these countries, you can actually argue that the source of their initial vulnerabilities was associated with the oil price shocks of the 70s, right? I mean, we know that in 1973 and 1979 there were important run-ups in oil prices. You can think of that process as the start of an inflationary process by which governments, in order to soften the blow, they borrowed, right? They increased their debts. Also, at the same time, Arab countries were recycling funds into the world economy. Borrowing was cheap, so it didn't make sense for these countries to actually increase their exposure to in terms of debt, right? Now, that sounds more true for Paraguay than for Peru, right? Peru at the time was an oil exporter, right? Paraguay has always been an oil importer. However, it was Peru, not Paraguay, that actually had inflation. You see what I'm saying? I mean, you may want to actually think about why is it that Paraguay did avoid inflation of the 80s, if you are thinking about the kind of explanation that I'm actually putting forward. So, and finally, all of this has to do with the big question to me, which is, well, who killed inflation at the end, right? I mean, a lot of countries in Latin America did experience very large inflations, but after 1991, more or less, all of these, a lot of these countries actually also experienced decreasing inflation, right? And this actually happened in countries that implemented an inflation targeting regime, but also in countries that did not, right? So we want to think that all of these institutions that we sell, like independent central bank constitutions, inflation targeting, and so on, they did help, right? But when I look at countries that did not have inflation targeting regimes, for example, then they also had inflation that came down. So it's not so clear to me that these institutions that we actually cherish and try to protect were the ones that actually ended up with the inflation rates of the 80s, right? I mean, the case of Paraguay is a case in point, I think, in my view, that deserves some thinking. All right, so the other comments were about the slides, but some of them were clarified during your presentation. For example, your last figures, you look at inflation against fiscal deficit, exchange rate, and external debt. I wasn't clear exactly what the point was. You might want to actually think about what kind of hypotheses you may want to. I mean, you did say something about, for example, the fact that you did not see a relationship between inflation and fiscal deficits. If that's your point, then you may want to make it some more formally. Maybe you run a regression or something of that sort, and so on. But those are minor points. Then much of the discussion actually has to do with the role of Itaupu, which now I understand, given the emphasis of the project. I mean, that's well taken. I mean, your argument that Itaupu was an important source of government revenues after what was that, 1986 or something like that. Then this is actually well taken. But in some sense, it's not surprising, right? I mean, so you may want to actually ask yourself, well, what is surprising or eye-opening in terms of what the conventional theory may be? Right? Maybe you want to connect that with the relatively mild inflation performance. Finally, I did notice the issue about growth accounting, right? That actually several people commented on, so I'm not going to add to that. I mean, it's obvious that if you might actually think about of ways of try to include IRAPU's infrastructure capital as a separate factor of production, so as to clean up that influence on productivity on the solar residual. Okay, so and that's what I have.